On May 2nd, get ready to escape. Isis, Escape from Transylvania. The goddess next door and John Haynes must escape a horde of vampires on the hunt in this horror-filled Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Escape from Transylvania in paperback and e-readers May 2nd.
Last night I was scheduled to make an appearance on the Obsidian radio show, and on that appearance we were supposed to talk about comic books, the comic book industry, African American fantasy, African American science fiction, and African American comic books. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make that appearance on the Obsidian radio show due to internet issues. As everyone knows, I have been out of work for the last 9 years, and because I have been out of work for the last 9 years, I primarily get my internet through the New York Public Library's Wi-Fi system. And because I get my internet primarily through the New York City's Public Library's Wi-Fi system, I just don't have the technology to do things like Google Hangouts. Now, I thought I would be able to do the Obsidian radio show through my cell phone. Unfortunately, my cell phone is one of these old Obama phones, which has very primitive technology. And because my cell phone has this primitive technology, I'm not able to do things like Google Hangouts. Now, when it comes down to African Americans, fantasy and science fiction, this is something I'm extremely passionate about because when it comes down to African American fantasy and science fiction, I really want more people to know about African American fantasy and science fiction, and I want them to know that there is a world of fantasy that African Americans can share and enjoy with each other, written by African American fantasy and science fiction authors like myself and guys like Mike Williams, who does the great Deke Sledge comic strip. There are a lot of great African American fantasy and science fiction creators who don't get the credit that they need, and they don't get the word of mouth that they deserve because most people stay mum about them instead of trying to get the word out about them. And this is something I wanted to talk about on Obsidian Radio Show because he has a large audience, and I wanted that audience to understand that there is a large group of African American fantasy creators, science fiction creators, and comic book creators who are looking to get new readers, and I wanted to use the show as a bridge to bring those readers not only to my books, but to those other black creators out there who have properties that they're developing and building. Because when it comes down to science fiction and fantasy, too many black people believe that it's a white thing when it's never been a white thing. When it comes down to comic books, science fiction, and fantasy, there is a place for African Americans, and it's a growing place for African Americans. And you can see that at places like many of the black Comic Cons that are coming up now, and you can see that in many places on social media because there are numerous forums for African American fantasy and science fiction and comic books. And most people, again, in the mainstream black community, they don't know about this, but I'm the guy who wants to really start building a bridge between the mainstream African American community and the community that has the science fiction and fantasy to show people that there are African Americans like myself out here who are creating fantasy and science fiction stories for African Americans. And one of the reasons why I decided to go into creating African American fantasy and science fiction was because I wanted to create positive images of African Americans and show you a richer picture of the African American experience. Because when it comes down to the African American experience, we often get a very narrow view of it, and we don't get to see the bigger picture of it. And one of the reasons why I go out here and write and publish African American fantasy and science fiction is so that people can see that there are African Americans out here who want to give you fantasy and science fiction from an African American perspective. Because there's a big difference between fantasy from a white perspective and fantasy from a black perspective. Because fantasy from a black perspective comes from our culture and our experiences, and that's something we really haven't seen that much outside of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Now, Star Trek Deep Space Nine was one of the few shows to give you fantasy from a black perspective, but outside of that show, we really have not seen that much fantasy from a black perspective. And one of the things I try to do is I try to incorporate black culture into my fantasy and science fiction, and I try to incorporate parts of black culture that we don't see in my black fantasy so that you can see our experiences and our culture in fantasy stories and see what's great about our culture and our experience, because you're not going to get that from mainstream culture. Because when I look at shows like Greg Berlanti's CW shows, where they'll put a black character on a show, they'll try to find some way to marginalize that character, minimize that character, or try to project stereotypes onto them, like they did with the DC Comics character Mr. Terrific. Now, Mr. Terrific in the comics is the world's third smartest man, and is an athlete on the level of Black Panther and Batman. But on the show, he's a gay, bumbling, stumbling idiot. And on Arrow, we had John Diggle, who was literally presented as the butler on the show, and then they go out and make him Green Arrow in a passive-aggressive way, and then they tell him that he's not good enough to be Green Arrow. And then I look at the new Warner Brothers show Titans, where they give us a Black Starfire, and instead of giving us an attractive, beautiful black female, what they do is they try to find ways to make her look uglier than she actually is. And this is what a lot of people have to deal with as related to African American characters in fantasy and science fiction, as related to mainstream media. And the way we can counter that is to go support our own characters, because when I go out here and create characters like Isis, Eaststeam, and John Haynes, I often make an effort to give us the most attractive images of African American women and African American men. And I also make efforts to give us the most positive portrayals of African Americans in fantasy and science fiction. Because when you take a look at the characters I create, you see strong, capable leaders, you see women who are strong and confident, and you see black people who are capable of handling crises and situations on the same level of white characters on teams like Justice League and the Avengers in stories like Isis, Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, or The Man Who Rules the World. In those type of stories, you see African Americans on the same level as white people, and you learn to see how great they are. Now, I wanted to go on Obsidian Radio last night to discuss the topics of comic books, the comic book industry, African American fantasy, and science fiction. Unfortunately, I just didn't have access to the economic resources to be able to go out here and buy things like home internet or a smartphone. And I really want to try to expand and build the SJS Direct imprint and the SJS Direct platform so that more people can learn more about African American fantasy and science fiction. And I can only do that with your help and support. So if you could donate anything to the Patreon by clicking the link in the description box, or sending a donation to PayPal to my email address, sjsdirectamerica@gmail.com, then maybe I can get the resources to go out here and be able to do things like Google Hangouts and do things like the Obsidian radio show, because I get offers to do radio shows all the time. Unfortunately, it's due to my lack of resources that prevent me from being able to reach out and spend more time with people online and then try to share things like African American fantasy and science fiction with them. But the only way I can really do that, again, is with your help and your support right now, because if it wasn't for your help and support right now, many of the books in the SJS Direct imprint, like Isis, Samurai Goddess, and Eaststeam Ascension, and Isis, Escape from Transylvania, those books would not be on Amazon.com right now without your help and support. And without your help and support, I wouldn't be able to try to expand this SJS Direct imprint and take things to the next level. Everything that is being done right now, I need your help to do, because I really want to go on places like Obsidian Radio and other radio shows to talk about African American fantasy and comic books, because I know that there are a lot of comic fans out there who want to see more African American fantasy and science fiction. I know that there are a lot of viewers who watch my videos and want to hear more about it. But I can only do that with your help and support. So if you could donate to the Patreon, or send a donation to the PayPal, or even go out and buy one of the SJS Direct books, it can help me go a long way in expanding this brand and getting the word out about African American fantasy and science fiction and comic books. Thank you for your time, and I really appreciate it.